The avoidant believes their defensive structure will protect them indefinitely, that they can maintain emotional distance throughout their life without facing consequences that matter, that their pattern of withdrawal represents a sustainable approach to human existence. They tell themselves they have chosen independence over vulnerability, that their solitude reflects preference rather than defense, that time will prove them right for avoiding the entanglements that complicate others' lives. The avoidant watches relationships around them struggle and congratulates themselves for avoiding such complications through their defended autonomy. They observe others' pain in intimacy and feel validated in their choice to remain protected behind walls that prevent such suffering. Years pass, and the avoidant continues their pattern. Brief connections that dissolve before intimacy deepens. Longer relationships maintained through emotional distance that eventually exhausts even the most patient partners. Periods of complete isolation that feel increasingly less like choice and more like a sentence. The avoidant dismisses each failed connection as evidence that they simply have not found the right person, that others want too much, that their standards are higher than those who settle for mediocre partnerships. Then time accumulates in ways that cannot be denied or dismissed. The avoidant reaches middle age and beyond, looking back on decades of defended isolation forward toward years that promise only more of the same. Time strips away the rationalizations that protected the avoidant's self-concept. Time removes the energy required to maintain rigid defenses. Time creates isolation that becomes unbearable rather than sustainable. Time exposes everything the avoidant sacrificed for safety that never actually made them safe. Time forces recognition that cannot be suppressed. The defensive structure that was supposed to protect them has imprisoned them. The emotional distance that felt like strength has created weakness. The pattern they believed would sustain them has destroyed their capacity for the very experiences that make human life meaningful. Time breaks the avoidant not through a single catastrophic event, but through the accumulated weight of decades lived in defended isolation, through undeniable recognition that their approach has cost them everything they claim not to need, but discover too late they desperately wanted. Time reveals the pattern they cannot deny. The avoidant navigates their 20s and early 30s with confidence that their defensive patterns reflect conscious choices rather than compulsive limitations. Each relationship that ends, each connection that fails to develop depth, each person who eventually leaves receives explanation that protects the avoidant's self-concept. That partner wanted too much. This person could not handle the avoidant's need for space. Those circumstances were wrong. The timing was off. The compatibility was insufficient. The avoidant constructs individual narratives for each failed connection that attribute the failure to external factors, to the other person's inadequacy, to situational circumstances beyond the avoidant's control. These explanations prevent the avoidant from recognizing the common thread running through every relational failure. As years accumulate, the pattern becomes increasingly difficult to ignore. The avoidant reaches their late 30s or 40s, having cycled through multiple relationships that followed eerily similar trajectories. Initial intensity, where the avoidant feels genuinely engaged. Gradual withdrawal as intimacy deepens. The other person's growing frustration with emotional unavailability. Eventual dissolution, when the other person can no longer tolerate the distance. The avoidant begins noticing that different partners in different circumstances at different life stages all eventually express remarkably similar complaints. They all wanted more emotional presence. They all felt held at distance. They all experienced the avoidance withdrawal as rejection. They all eventually chose to leave rather than continue accepting minimal intimacy. This repetition forces recognition the avoidant has successfully avoided during individual relationships. When one person leaves citing the avoidant's emotional unavailability, the avoidant can dismiss that person as demanding or incompatible. When multiple people across years cite the same patterns, when the avoidant hears virtually identical feedback from partners who share nothing except having been in relationship with the avoidant, the external attribution becomes unsustainable. The avoidant must confront that they are the common denominator, that their defensive structure creates outcomes that repeat regardless of who they are with or what circumstances surround the relationship. Time also reveals that the avoidant's promises of change made during moments when they fear losing someone never materialize into sustained behavioral shift. The avoidant looks back across years and sees a pattern of temporary adjustments followed by return to defended distance. They recognize that every time someone threatened to leave, the avoidant made promises about becoming more available, more present, more emotionally engaged. They see that these promises briefly delayed departure, but never represented genuine transformation. The avoidant became slightly more available for weeks or months before gravitating back to familiar defended position. Time exposes that the avoidant's stated desire for change has never translated into actual capacity for sustained different behavior. The pattern time reveals extends beyond romantic relationships to friendships and family connections. The avoidant recognizes that they maintain surface-level friendships that never deepen, that family members have stopped expecting emotional availability from them, that people in their life have learned not to depend on them for genuine support or presence. The avoidant sees across decades how they have kept everyone at manageable distance, how they have never allowed sustained intimacy in any relational domain. This recognition forces awareness that the pattern is not about finding wrong romantic partners, but rather reflects fundamental limitation in the avoidant's capacity for intimate connection of any kind. Time also strips away the avoidant's ability to attribute their pattern to being young or still figuring out what they want. In their 20s, the avoidant could tell themselves they were simply not ready for serious relationship, that they needed time to establish themselves before committing deeply to another person. In their 30s, the avoidant could maintain that they had not yet met the right person, or that their standards required patience. By their 40s and beyond, these explanations lose credibility. The avoidant has had ample time to figure out what they want. They have encountered numerous potential partners across diverse circumstances. They have matured in many life domains while their relational patterns remain unchanged. Time reveals that readiness and compatibility are not the issues. The avoidant's defensive structure is the constant preventing sustained intimacy. The avoidant confronts that while everything else in their life has evolved, while they have grown professionally, developed expertise, achieved goals, their relational capacity has remained frozen in the same defended position they occupied in early adulthood. Peers who struggled with intimacy in their 20s have developed secure relationships. Friends who once shared the avoidant's discomfort with vulnerability have learned to sustain partnerships. The avoidant alone seems unable to progress beyond their defended starting point. This stagnation, while others develop, becomes increasingly visible across time, forcing recognition that their pattern represents limitation rather than preference. Time additionally reveals that the avoidant's claimed contentment with solitude has never been as complete as they professed. Looking back across years, the avoidant recognizes moments of profound loneliness they dismissed at the time. Instances of longing for connection they suppressed, periods where they felt the weight of their isolation but defended against acknowledging it. The accumulation of these moments across decades exposes that the avoidant has been less content and more defended than they admitted. Time strips away the day-to-day rationalizations and reveals the underlying pattern. Chronic loneliness, occasionally interrupted by brief connections that the avoidant inevitably destroys through their withdrawal. The pattern time reveals becomes undeniable when the avoidant watches what happens to people who stayed in their life despite the avoidant's limitations. The few friends who tolerated the avoidant's distance gradually invest less in the relationship, recognizing that the avoidant will never reciprocate their effort. Family members who once tried to maintain closeness eventually accept the avoidant's preference for distance and stop attempting to bridge the gap. Even these accepting relationships deteriorate across time because connection requires mutual effort that the avoidant has never provided. The avoidant faces that their pattern does not preserve relationships at comfortable distance, but rather slowly erodes all relationships regardless of how patient or understanding others are. Time removes the energy required to maintain their defenses. The avoidance defensive structure requires enormous psychological energy to maintain. Though this cost remains largely invisible during youth, when energy reserves are substantial, the avoidant must constantly monitor their emotional exposure, regulate their vulnerability, manage their intimacy levels to prevent closeness from exceeding their defended comfort zone. They must maintain vigilance against their own impulses toward connection, suppress needs for emotional support, override natural human desires for genuine intimacy. This perpetual self-management operates like a background program consuming resources, creating exhaustion the avoidant attributes to external factors rather than recognizing as the cost of their defensive living. During early adulthood, the avoidant possesses energy to sustain this defensive structure while simultaneously building career, pursuing interests, and maintaining social facade that conceals their internal isolation. The avoidant can work full-time, engage in activities, manage relationships at surface level, and still have resources left to maintain the rigid boundaries, preventing genuine intimacy. The energy cost of defended living remains sustainable because youth provides abundant reserves. The avoidant does not recognize that a significant portion of their vitality is consumed by psychological defense maintenance rather than being available for actually living. As the avoidant ages, the energy available for defensive maintenance gradually diminishes. Physical aging reduces overall vitality. Life's accumulated stresses deplete psychological reserves. The effort required to maintain defended position begins consuming a greater percentage of the avoidant's declining energy. The avoidant discovers that what felt effortless at 25 feels exhausting at 45. The constant vigilance, the perpetual emotional regulation, the continuous suppression of genuine feelings and needs becomes increasingly burdensome. The avoidant begins experiencing their defensive structure as weight they carry rather than protection they benefit from. Time also brings life circumstances that demand energy the avoidant previously allocated to defense maintenance. Career pressures intensify. Health issues emerge requiring attention and resources. Parents age and need care. Financial responsibilities accumulate. The avoidant faces competing demands for their limited energy and discovers that maintaining rigid psychological defenses while managing life's increasing complexity exceeds their capacity. The avoidant must choose between sustaining their defensive structure or adequately handling life's demands. And they begin recognizing that their defenses consume resources they desperately need for other purposes. The physical toll of chronic defended living also becomes undeniable across time. The avoidant experiences stress-related health issues that emerge from decades of suppressing emotions, avoiding vulnerability, and maintaining hypervigilance against intimacy. Sleep disturbances, digestive problems, chronic pain, anxiety symptoms, all manifestations of a nervous system that has spent decades in defended alert state. The avoidance body begins breaking down under the sustained stress that defensive living creates. Time reveals that the psychological protection came at profound physiological costs that accumulates interest across years. The avoidant also loses the resilience that allowed quick recovery from relational endings in youth. In their 20s and 30s, the avoidant could end a relationship, briefly feel discomfort, then return to defended equilibrium within weeks. As decades pass, each ending takes longer to recover from, leaves a deeper mark, creates greater disruption to the avoidant's sense of stability. The avoidant discovers that their capacity to bounce back from loss has diminished across time. The cumulative impact of pushed away connections, destroyed relationships, and maintained isolation creates wounds that heal more slowly with each repetition. Time reveals that the avoidance defensive structure was never a low-maintenance system they imagined, but rather a high-cost approach that appeared sustainable only because they were not accounting for its actual expense. The avoidant allocated their energy budget as if defense maintenance cost nothing, as if the psychological resources required to remain perpetually defended were unlimited. Age exposes this accounting error. The avoidant faces that they have been spending energy their entire life that they needed for other purposes, that the defended position has consumed vitality that could have been invested in genuine living, that the protection cost more than it ever provided. The loss of energy across time also eliminates the avoidance capacity for the secondary compensatory behaviors that made their isolated life feel tolerable. The avoidant previously filled the void left by lack of intimacy through intense work focus, extensive travel, consuming hobbies, or other activities that required high energy investment. As energy declines, the avoidant can no longer maintain these substitutes. They lack stamina for the career intensity that once distracted from relational emptiness. They have less enthusiasm for the travel that once compensated for loneliness. They cannot sustain the hobby involvement that previously filled space that intimacy would occupy. Without these compensatory distractions, the avoidant sits with unmediated awareness of what their defensive structure has cost them. Time forces recognition that maintaining defenses becomes increasingly difficult, while the consequences of those defenses become increasingly unbearable. The avoidant faces an intensifying bind. They lack energy to sustain their defensive structure adequately, yet they also lack energy to dismantle it and build new relational capacities. The defensive patterns are so entrenched that changing them would require enormous effort, precisely when the avoidant has less effort to spare. The avoidant discovers they are trapped in a system. They no longer have resources to maintain, but also cannot escape, because escape would demand resources they no longer possess. The exhaustion time creates also penetrates the avoidance, conscious awareness in ways that use, energy, abundance prevented. The avoidant begins noticing how tired they feel, how little reserve they have, how their defended position drains them. They recognize the constant low-level anxiety that vigilance against intimacy creates. They feel the weight of suppressed needs and feelings accumulated across decades. They experience their defensive structure not as protection, but as burden, not as chosen autonomy, but as exhausting imprisonment. Time strips away the energy that allowed the avoidant to ignore how much their defenses were costing them, forcing them to finally feel the full expense of their defended existence. Time creates isolation that becomes unbearable. The avoidant navigates early adulthood surrounded by people who provide enough connection to prevent the full weight of isolation from registering. College friends, work colleagues, casual dating partners, family members all create a social fabric that gives the illusion of connection, despite the avoidant maintaining emotional distance from all of them. The avoidant attends gatherings, participates in activities, engages in conversations that remain comfortably surface level. This social involvement allows the avoidant to feel they have adequate human contact while never risking the vulnerability that genuine intimacy requires. The avoidant tells themselves they are not isolated because they have people in their life, failing to recognize that quantity of shallow connections does not compensate for absence of depth. Time gradually erodes the social fabric in ways the avoidant does not anticipate. Friends from college move away, marry, have children, and develop lives that no longer include space for friendships maintained at the superficial level the avoidant requires. Work colleagues change as the avoidant shifts jobs, or as turnover brings new people who never invest in relationships with someone who remains perpetually distant. Casual dating partners stop accepting the avoidant's limited availability as they seek more substantial connections. Family members age and die, removing relationships that required no effort from the avoidant, because family connection existed by default rather than through the avoidance investment. The avoidant reaches middle age and discovers that the social abundance of youth has contracted significantly. People who once tolerated the avoidant's distance have stopped reaching out. Friends who once invited the avoidant to gatherings despite receiving minimal reciprocation have given up. The avoidant's phone rings less frequently, their calendar contains fewer social engagements, their life has fewer people in it, and the people who remain are those satisfied with surface-level connection that requires nothing of the avoidant, which means those relationships provide nothing substantial to the avoidant either. Time also shifts how others perceive and respond to the avoidant's defended distance. In their 20s, the avoidant's emotional unavailability could be attributed to being young, still developing, not yet ready for depth. Others made allowances, gave benefit of doubt, waited patiently for the avoidant to mature into greater capacity for connection. By middle age, these charitable interpretations disappear. The avoidance patterns are recognized as permanent rather than developmental. People stop waiting for the avoidant to become more available because years of evidence demonstrate that change will not occur. The avoidant loses the grace period that youth provided, facing that their limitations are no longer viewed as temporary struggles but as fixed characteristics others must accept or leave. The avoidant watches peers build lives characterized by depth of connection. The avoidant has never allowed themselves to experience. Friends celebrate decades-long marriages, have children who become independent adults, maintain friendships that span their entire adult lives. These peers have people who know them deeply, who have witnessed their evolution across time, who hold their history and understand their journey. The avoidant has none of this. They have moved through life, leaving no deep connections, building no sustained intimacy, allowing no one to truly know them across time. The isolation that was once masked by abundant, shallow connections becomes starkly visible in contrast to peers' deep relational networks. Time creates a particular crisis when the avoidant faces difficulty that requires support. They have never allowed anyone to provide. Illness strikes, career failure occurs, a parent dies, or other life challenge demands the kind of intimate support that only deep connections offer. The avoidant discovers they have no one to call, no one who feels obligated or connected enough to show up during genuine need, no one who knows them well enough to provide meaningful comfort. The avoidant must face their difficulty alone, not because circumstances force solitude, but because their decades of defended distance have ensured they have no genuine support network to draw upon. The isolation intensifies as the avoidant recognizes they have become invisible in ways that youth prevented. Younger avoidants still attract attention, still receive invitations based on potential future connection, still generate interest from others, hoping to break through their defenses. Older avoidants become easier to dismiss, easier to give up on, easier to simply stop including. The avoidant discovers that their defended position, which once felt like a powerful choice, has rendered them irrelevant. People have learned that investing in the avoidant provides no return, that including them in their lives enriches nothing, that the avoidance's presence or absence makes minimal difference. The avoidant has achieved their goal of needing no one, only to discover this means no one needs them either. Time forces recognition that the loneliness the avoidant briefly experienced during youth has become a chronic state rather than a temporary condition. The avoidant can no longer tell themselves that their isolation is temporary, that they simply have not met the right people yet, that circumstances will shift. Decades have passed. Numerous people have entered and left the avoidant's life. Circumstances have changed repeatedly, yet the isolation persists because it stems not from external factors, but from the avoidance's internal defensive structure. The avoidant faces that their loneliness is self-created, permanent unless they change their approach, and has become the defining characteristic of their existence. The unbearable quality of the isolation emerges from the avoidant's growing awareness that it will only intensify with continued aging. The avoidant looks ahead to their 60s, 70s, 80s, and sees isolation that deepens with each passing year. They imagine facing declining health alone, experiencing losses without support, spending their final years with no one who knows them or cares deeply about their well-being. This projected future creates existential terror the avoidant can no longer suppress. The defended position that was supposed to protect them has created a trajectory toward dying alone, unmourned except by people who never truly knew them. The avoidant also confronts that their isolation has prevented them from contributing to anything beyond themselves. They have built no family, mentored no one deeply enough to impact their development, created no lasting intimate connections that enriched others' lives. The avoidant's life, when examined across time, reveals relentless focus on self-protection that prevented them from meaningfully affecting or being affected by others. This recognition creates devastating awareness that their defended existence has been fundamentally sterile, producing nothing of lasting relational value, leaving no genuine human legacy. Time exposes that the avoidant has spent their life protecting themselves from intimacy so successfully that they have prevented themselves from mattering to anyone in ways that persist beyond immediate interaction. Time exposes what they sacrificed for safety. The avoidant has spent decades making trade-offs they never consciously acknowledged, sacrificing depth for distance, intimacy for safety, vulnerability for control. During youth, these sacrifices feel costless because the avoidant retains option value. They can tell themselves that they could choose intimacy later if they wanted, that they are simply prioritizing other things now, that they have time to develop relational depth when circumstances are right. The avoidant perceives their defensive choices as temporary strategies rather than recognizing them as cumulative sacrifices that foreclose possibilities across time. Each withdrawn moment, each avoided vulnerability, each destroyed connection represents opportunity cost. The avoidant does not calculate because they assume infinite future opportunities will remain available. Time reveals the falseness of this assumption. The avoidant reaches a stage of life where they can no longer tell themselves that intimate connection remains available whenever they choose to pursue it. The realistic pool of potential partners has contracted significantly. The energy required to build deep connection from nothing has exceeded what the avoidant possesses. The neuroplasticity that would allow developing new relational capacities has diminished. The avoidant faces that the safety they purchase through defended distance costs them access to experiences that are no longer available, that the window for certain human experiences has closed while they remain protected behind their walls. The avoidant recognizes they have sacrificed the experience of being truly known by another person across sustained time. They see peers with partners who understand them intimately, who have witnessed their evolution across decades, who know their history and context in ways that create profound sense of being seen. The avoidant has never allowed this level of knowing. They have kept everyone at sufficient distance that no one has ever genuinely understood them across time. This sacrifice means the avoidant has spent their entire adult life fundamentally alone in their internal experience, never sharing their authentic self with anyone deeply enough or long enough to be truly comprehended. Time exposes that the avoidant has sacrificed the particular intimacy that develops only through weathering difficulty together. The avoidant's defended position has prevented them from experiencing how connection deepens when two people support each other through loss, illness, failure, or crisis. They have missed the profound bonding that occurs when vulnerability is met with sustained presence, when weakness is witnessed without judgment, when need is responded to with genuine care. The avoidant protected themselves from the risk that vulnerability during difficulty creates. But this protection also eliminated access to the deepest forms of intimacy that only shared struggle produces. The avoidant also sees that they have sacrificed opportunities to develop relational capacities that atrophy through disuse. The ability to sustain intimacy, to navigate conflict constructively, to remain present during emotional intensity, to trust another person deeply, all represent skills that develop through practice. The avoidant's decades of defensive distance meant they never practiced these capacities in contexts where they could develop. Time reveals that the safety the avoidant purchased through withdrawal came at cost of stunted relational development. The avoidant remains relationally immature regardless of their chronological age, possessing the intimacy capacities of someone who stopped developing emotionally in early adulthood. Time exposes that the avoidant has sacrificed the security that actually comes from sustained intimate connection. The avoidant thought they were choosing safety by maintaining defenses that prevented others from getting close enough to hurt them. Yet time reveals that the isolation their defenses created produces profound insecurity. The avoidant has no one to depend on, no one whose presence they can rely upon, no one whose commitment to them has been tested and proven across years. The avoidant faces life's challenges alone without the actual security that knowing someone will be there provides. They purchase safety from vulnerability while sacrificing the safety that comes from genuine connection. The avoidant recognizes they have sacrificed experiences that give life meaning that they now lack time to access. The particular intimacy of raising children with a partner, the depth that comes from decades-long partnership, the richness of being genuinely known across one's adult life, all require time that the avoidant has spent maintaining defenses rather than building connections. The avoidant cannot go back and have children with someone they build sustained partnership with across 20 years. They cannot retroactively create the history with another person that provides a sense of shared life. Time has passed in ways that foreclose these possibilities, revealing that the safety the avoidant chose cost them access to experiences that make human existence feel purposeful. Time forces the avoidant to face that they have sacrificed the possibility of dying having mattered deeply to someone, having been essential to another person's life, having left space in the world that their absence makes palpably empty. The avoidant will die having protected themselves so successfully that they remained peripheral to everyone's life, important to no one in ways that persist beyond immediate interaction. This recognition creates existential grief that dwarfs any temporary pain that vulnerability might have caused. The avoidant discovers they have spent their life avoiding small pains while ensuring they will experience the ultimate pain, dying alone, unmourned in ways that reflect deep knowing, having lived an entire existence without risking being genuinely seen and loved.